All right, good morning, everyone. Good morning. Thank you all for coming. This is our inaugural Property Rights Practice Group panel presentation. We have the Saturday late morning spot. I guess the silver lining to all of our flights home being delayed or canceled is that we can all attend today, so I thank you for coming. My name is Steve Davis. I am the chair of the new practice group for property rights. We are a brand new practice group. We just split off from the Environment and Natural Resources group. We're a small practice group just starting out, so if you're interested, I encourage you to come check us out, and thank you for coming today. It's my privilege to introduce our moderator today, Judge Ed Artow, who is a United States District Court Judge for the Southern District of Florida. Congratulations to Judge Artow. He was recently confirmed as a U.S. District Judge. He's no stranger to the bench, though. He's been a Florida trial court judge and also served on the 4th District Court of Appeals in Florida, having been appointed by both Governors Rick Scott and Governor DeSantis. He's also an adjunct professor at St. Thomas University College of Law and served as the Dean of the Advanced Judicial Studies College and on the faculty of both the Florida Judicial College and the Advanced Judicial Studies College. He's a graduate of Georgetown Law School, and prior to that, he studied at Nova Southeastern University, which later awarded him an honorary doctorate of laws. So I'll turn it over to Judge Artow.
Thank you. Good morning. Our topic is socialism or sensible protections, zoning, rent control, and the roots of the housing crisis. So we have a very interesting panel for you today. Property rights have been an important consideration in the Anglo-American legal tradition. As Sir William Blackstone described, private property rights are derived from the law of nature. So the English common law was extremely watchful in ascertaining and protecting this right. The Founding Fathers echoed similar sentiments. John Adams equated property with liberty. And in Federalist number 10, James Madison stated that the first object of government is to protect private property rights. James Madison then went on to state that beliefs around property rights form the most common and durable sources of political factions. In more modern times, many of these debates and factions involve zoning and other land use requirements that we're going to discuss here today. In fact, next year will be the 100th anniversary of the Supreme Court's decision in Village of Euclid versus Ambler Realty Company. And in that case, in Euclid, the Supreme Court held that if zoning ordinances are not arbitrary and capricious, they are constitutional under the police powers of local governments so long as they have some relation to public health, safety, morals, or general welfare, and what the nature of those relations are and what constitutes enough for that purpose is debatable and something we're going to discuss here today. This has led to various different zoning regulations across the various states, and we're going to discuss some of those today with our panel. From Zohran Mamdani's mayoral campaign's promise to remake New York housing and California Governor Gavin Newsom's recent attempts to stimulate housing development, housing issues like rent control, zoning laws, and environmental regulations are in the spotlight. This panel considers whether regulations like exclusionary zoning and rent control can worsen the housing crisis, and if stronger judicial enforcement of property rights offers any type of solution to the housing crisis. On the panel today, we are fortunate to have James Burling. James Burling attended the University of Arizona College of Law in Tucson, where he served as an editor for the Law Review and received a JD degree in 1983. He had previously received a master's degree in geological sciences from Brown University and an undergraduate degree from Hamilton College in New York. He received the Professional Achievement Award from the University of Arizona Alumni Association in 2018. Mr. Burling has worked tirelessly with Pacific Legal Foundation since 1983, litigating cases from Alaska to Florida. He is a member of the Federalist Society's Environmental Law and Property Rights Practice Group's Executive Committee, a member of the American College of Real Estate Lawyers, and an honorary member of the Owners Council of America. The Owners Council awarded him its Crystal Eagle Award in 2013. In 2022, he was also awarded the Brigham Canner Property Rights Prize at the William and Mary College of Law. This prize is awarded annually to an individual whose work has advanced the causes of property rights and has contributed to the overall awareness of the important role property rights occupy in the broader scheme of individual liberty. In 2001, Mr. Burling successfully argued a major property rights case. You guys may have heard of a case called Palazzolo versus Rhode Island before the United States Supreme Court, a case which affirmed the rights in regulated property that they do not disappear when land is just bought and sold and transferred. He has a book that he's going to probably tell us a little bit more about called Nowhere to Live, The Hidden Story of America's Housing Crisis. Join me in welcoming Mr. Burling. We also have on our panel J. Peter Byrne, who is the John Hampton Baumgartner Chair in Real Property Law Emeritus at Georgetown Law. We have joined history together because Professor Byrne started at Georgetown as a professor in 1985, and I started as a student at Georgetown in 1985. So he's been at Georgetown all these years, and I'm very happy to be on the panel with my prior professor. Professor Byrne joined the Law Center, as I said, the year I did in '85 after graduating from the University of Virginia Law School. He served as a law clerk to Judge Frank Coffin and U.S. Supreme Court Justice Louis Paul, and then worked as an associate with the D.C. firm of Covington and Burling. He teaches and writes in the areas of property, land use, constitutional law, and higher education law and policy. He did serve as Associate Dean for the law school at Georgetown from 1997 to the year 2000. He was also the Carroll Research Professor there from 1996 to 1997. He has written extensively on topics that we're going to cover here today. He co-authored with our other panel member, our other esteemed panel member, Sara Bronin, historic preservation law. He has co-authored a number of other articles, cultural property, progressive property in action, the Freedmen's Memorial to Lincoln, a postscript to Stone Mountain and flexible laws, and heritage suspension, law on public emergencies. Join me in welcoming Professor Byrne. Our next esteemed panel member is Sara Bronin. Sara is an architect, attorney, professor, and policymaker. She has also written extensively on the subject. She has written Key to the City, How Zoning Shapes Our World, and she founded and directs the National Zoning Atlas, which she's going to tell us a lot about, and the National Preservation Atlas. Professor Bronin is a recognized expert in property land use, zoning, and historic preservation law. She is the Freda H. Alverson Professor of Law at the George Washington University Law School. Prior to joining the George Washington University Law School, she was a tenured professor at Cornell University. Professor Bronin has co-authored several books and treatises, including the Land Use volume of the Restatement Fourth of Property, She has also written dozens of law review articles. Professor Bronin has chaired the Planning and Zoning Commission of Connecticut's capital city for 7 years, leading its efforts to overhaul its zoning code and to adopt a new decennial city plan. Professor Bronin was nominated by President Biden and confirmed by the Senate in 2022 to serve as the 12th chair of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. Professor Bronin also has served as a board member of Latinos in Heritage Conservation and advisor for the National Trust for Historic Preservation and the chair of Preservation Connecticut, as well as the vice chair of the City of Hartford Historic Preservation Commission. She holds a JD degree from Yale Law School and a master's from the University of Oxford and a bachelor's of art in architecture from the University of Texas. Among other honors, she received the Heinz Award for Excellence, and she received an honorary degree from Trinity College. While in law school, she interned with then Judge Sonia Sotomayor of the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. She's a seventh-generation Texan, a native Houstonian from Houston, and she grew up working in her grandparents' Mexican restaurant. Join me in welcoming the professor, please. And last but certainly not least, we have Ilya Somin. Ilya is a professor of law at George Mason University, Antonin Scalia Law School, and the B. Kenneth Simon Chair in Constitutional Studies at the Cato Institute. His research focuses on constitutional law, property law, democratic theory, federalism, and migration rights. He is the author of Free to Move, Foot Voting, Migration and Political Freedom, Democracy and Political Ignorance, Why Smaller Government is Smarter, and the Grasping Hand, Kelo versus City of New London and the Limits of Eminent Domain. He's also the co-author of A Conspiracy Against Obamacare, The Bullock Conspiracy, and the Healthcare Case, and co-editor of Eminent Domain, A Comparative Perspective. Somin's work has appeared in numerous scholarly journals, including the Yale Law Journal, Stanford Law Review, Northwestern University Law Review, the Georgetown Law Journal, Critical Review, and others. He has been quoted or interviewed by the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, The Economist, the Christian Science Monitor, and a number of other media outlets. Somin's writings have been cited in decisions by the United States Supreme Court, multiple state Supreme Courts, and lower federal courts, as well as the Supreme Court of Israel. He has testified on the use of drones for targeted killings in the War on Terror before the United States Judiciary Subcommittee on the Constitution, Civil Rights, and Human Rights. He writes regularly for the Bullock Conspiracy Law and Politics blog, and from 2006 to 2013, he served as co-author of the Supreme Court Economic Review. Before joining the faculty at George Mason University, he was a visiting professor at the University of Pennsylvania, as well as Georgetown University Law Center, and he was the John M. Olin Fellow in Law at Northwestern University Law School. He also clerked for the Honorable Judge Jerry Smith of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, and earned his B.A. summa cum laude at Amherst College, M.A. in Political Science, and his J.D. And a master's degree in political science from Harvard University, and his J.D. from Yale Law School. Join me in welcoming Professor Somin. Okay, so we're going to kick off the program, and I'm going to have James Burling give us his presentation first.
Thank you. Thank you very much to the Federalist Society for inviting me here. The first time I did a property rights thing at the Federalist Society, it was at the Mayflower in a room about a quarter this size. So it's nice to be growing. However, because I do not need a weatherman to know which way the wind is blowing, I have to start by congratulating Mayor-elect Mamdani from New York City. And I am going to suggest that he is obviously the wave of the future. But he hasn't gone far enough in his promises. He talks about a rent freeze. Why not free rent? He talks about city grocery stores. Why not free groceries? All he has to do to achieve this socialist nirvana that hasn't been achieved anywhere else is to repeal one simple, archaic, old law that is really hindering the way of socialism. If he can only repeal this law, he has it made. The law, of course, is the law of supply and demand. If he can repeal that, everything is going to go smoothly. Now, our housing crisis is a result of the law of supply and demand, but it's not a new thing. I'm going to read to you briefly from a 1991 presidential commission. Millions of Americans are being priced out of buying or renting the kind of housing they would otherwise could afford were it not for a web of government regulations. Or how about this, from 1969, the National Commission on Urban Problems Building in the American City. A third of our nation cannot afford adequate, non-subsidized housing today, despite great strides in our housing stock. Now today, 2025, we need to build roughly 2 million new housing units per year. We are building roughly half that number every year. Every year, the law of supply and demand gets worse and worse. We thought things were bad in 1969 and then in 1991, but what we have today are people living in the streets of all the major cities of America. We never had that before. We never had the looks of like we were a third world country. So how did we get here? I think that we got here through a slow, inexorable process. Back in the 1980s or late 1970s, I bought my first home. It was a 900 square foot, 2-bedroom, 1-bath home made out of cinder blocks and an old tar paper roof in Tucson, Arizona. It cost me over $20,000, which was a lot of money back then for a young couple starting out. But you cannot build that kind of house anymore. It's illegal to build small houses like that, or it makes no economic sense because you have zoning with large lot sizes. So, of course, in 1981, or when I bought that house, the median income was $22,000. The average interest rates were about 16%. I paid about 13% on that house. So the root causes, the LA Times was asking people, they did a survey a few years ago. Number one, people responding to the survey said it's a lack of rent control, 28%. Some said lack of subsidies, 24%. Environmental regulations, they're starting to get there, 17%. Too little home building, 13%. Restrictive zoning rules, 9%. So let me start by talking about exclusionary zoning. Zoning in America really began in 1910. George McMetchen was a Yale-educated attorney. He and his schoolteacher wife bought a house in a nice area in Baltimore. But before he was able to move in, mobs of young men threw rocks through every window in his home. Why? Because it was a nice neighborhood. It was a nice all-white neighborhood, and George McMetchen and his wife were all black. That resulted by December of that year in the nation's first zoning law, which was an exclusionary zoning law, which is a racially exclusionary zoning law that made it a crime for a black person to move into a white neighborhood and in a cynical tip of the hat, vice versa. You could be subject up to a fine in today's dollar, be $3,000, and up to a year in jail for doing that. Now, that was struck down by the Supreme Court on a property rights basis. The Supreme Court said that it was in direct violation of the fundamental law enacted in the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, preventing state interference with property rights except by due process of law. Now, we just heard about the Euclid case, almost coming up to 100 years next year. The trial court looked at this zoning in Euclid, which was not racially based, it was economically based. It was one of these comprehensive zoning laws that said, all over here, you're going to have large lot, single-family homes. We have the industrial area here. And the trial court kind of thought it was too bad that the racial zoning was struck down. The trial court said the blighting of property values and the congesting of population, and I'm quoting now because this is tough to say, whenever the colored or certain foreign races invade a residential section are so well known to be within the judicial cognizance. But he said if that rule was so bad, it struck this one, which is, less severe, the economic zoning, he had to strike that one down too. But the Supreme Court reversed because any rule that prevented zoning was good because apartments are like, any rule that prevented apartments was good because apartments are like a pig in a parlor. Very often the apartment house is a mere parasite. Now, since then, we basically had zoning laws written across America with exclusionary effect. And I do commend to you Professor Bronin's book, Key to the City. It talks about this in great detail. A number of other books, my book too, Nowhere to Live, talks in detail about the effects of zoning, large lot exclusionary zoning across America that has made it difficult for people to afford the homes they wish to live in. The next area that I talk about in my book is rent control. It's a disincentive for new construction. Now, an economist in 1972 named Asser Lindbeck said that in many cases, rent control appears to be the most efficient technique presently known to destroy a city, except for bombing. True enough. Now, some people think that, zoning or rent control is kind of a communist plot. So let me read to you from a commie. This is a foreign minister of Vietnam who wrote in 1989, "The Americans couldn't destroy Hanoi, but we have destroyed our city by very low rents. We realized it was stupid and we must change policy." Nevertheless, we have a resurgence in zoning and people wanting zoning. In California city after California city, rent control laws are being adopted. Although voters 3 times in California voted it down, $300 million were spent in these initiatives, the legislature is still trying to get rent control through. We have environmental regulation, the third tier of why housing is so expensive. To build homes in some places like California, you have to go through lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit. In my book, I talk about housing projects that have taken 20 years. And they're still not completely off the ground because of one lawsuit is filed, it's settled, it's dealt with, and somebody comes in at the next iteration of the California Environmental Quality Act, Environmental Impact Report, sues again. We have excessive fees and exactions, the fourth area that I talk about, causing housing shortages. We've had an increase in the years, well past inflation, of the amount of fees being imposed for housing. California, the average is $29,000 per housing unit. It ranges from $20,000 to $156,000 for fees in California. Other states are less than that, but all these fees add to the cost of housing. And lastly, my book talks about eminent domain abuse, less of an immediate issue, but for a long time it was an issue because between 1949 and 1963, 63% of displaced people were minorities as eminent domain and redevelopment bulldozed inner cities, thinking that these were blighted neighborhoods and ignoring the fact that there were people living and breathing and working and having their lives in these communities. I talk about in my book about Aurora Vargas. She was a World War II widow. She lived in Chavez Ravine, a place in a suburb of Los Angeles. It was a down and out area because the city didn't want to bring services to this Mexican-American community. And there's a picture in my book of her being carried out of her home by sheriff's deputies. Bulldozers are standing by, and within a few minutes of her being carried out of her home, bulldozers knocked it down. It was taken through eminent domain. She was paid a fraction of what it was worth, and her property was used for a redevelopment project, which is Dodger Stadium. So you can blame the World Series on the Los Angeles Police Department condemning her property, okay? Highways are the other areas that a lot of inner city neighborhoods are thrown out. There is a book recently written, or a few years ago, called The Folklore of the Hot Freeway. And there's a line in there, if future anthropologists want to find the remains of people of color in a post-apocalypse America, they will simply find the ruins of the nearest freeway, because that's what we did. We have not, minority populations in working class neighborhoods have not yet recovered from the abuse of eminent domain and redevelopment, and we have that legacy with today. Thank you.
Next, we will hear from Professor Peter Byrne.
Well, good morning, everyone. Pleasure for me to be here with these very distinguished speakers. I'm shocked to find how much I agree with Jim Burling. He and I have debated over many topics over the years, but I think today there is a pretty wide consensus that zoning needs to be reformed. And particularly the zoning which has the main purpose of being exclusionary, large lot zoning designed to prevent greater density, therefore more affordable housing. Moreover, we have too many choke points in the land use system where opponents are able to raise issues and stretch things out and basically kill projects through delay and affecting financing and that sort of thing. And relaxing many of these excessive zoning rules will help to increase supply, and that should affect price to some extent. But it's really more a matter, in my mind, of evolving land use and housing policy to meet the current needs of the population and the economy, rather than a sort of a new elevation of property rights. We need when you eliminate old rules, you need new rules sometimes. So Minneapolis, Minnesota has been recognized as being one of the most successful cities in increasing housing supply and thereby moderating the increase in housing prices. And they, for example, have very much limited single-family zoning. They've also eliminated parking minimums for multifamily houses. But they have also enacted rules to make the system work better. So Minneapolis, for example, has minimum heights for multifamily. In other words, instead of maximum heights, they have minimum heights for multiple family housing to sort of encourage it. And minimum lot coverage in order to promote larger buildings. So those are different kinds of rules. It's not no rules. And to some extent, in some minds, it would say it impinges on property rights, but they're different rules. When you have people living closer together in greater density, you need different kinds of rules. I live in a row house here in Washington, and a block and a half away, there's a whole restaurant level. And the big issue that people have are the enforcement of rules requiring restaurants to keep their trash inside. Why? Because we have rats in our patios. Right? So when you put people closer together, the exercise of property rights by one person can impinge on the property rights of others because they're closer together. They live in more of a community. You need some kind of balance. And eliminating parking minimums typically requires investments in public transit in order to make that work, or else you just have a parking disaster. Okay. Moreover, and this is the second point to make, deregulation or upzoning is not going to provide affordable housing for the bottom half or maybe bottom 3/4 of the population. The supply, because much of our problem with housing, plainly zoning, there are zoning issues that need to be addressed, is that demand for housing is being concentrated in particular jurisdictions that either have outstanding employment prospects for well-educated people, driving up prices, or they have very high amenity values. where people just sort of want to be because it's very pleasant, it's very pretty, and historic districts are sometimes a part of that. You have to have, so the private market is not going to provide affordable housing for the bottom half of the population. You have to have some kind of subsidy system. And the question then becomes, what is a sensible way to run a subsidy system? Sorry, I'm really not a socialist, but it seems to me the best model involve various forms of financing subsidies for nonprofit low-income housing developers to encourage them to build housing that is affordable, and then providing vouchers of some sort so that poor people don't pay more than 30% of their income on housing and the government pays the rest. Those vouchers are important because they provide the funds to allow the managers of those houses to maintain upkeep. One of the disasters of public housing in the United States has always been that they don't take in enough, that public housing authorities don't take in enough money to maintain the buildings in a way that promotes good behavior and comfort for the residents. There are lots of ways to debate the structure of these things, and there's a bill that's been passed by the U.S. Senate, sponsored by Senator Tim Scott. It's a bipartisan bill that provides a sort of a new approach to financing for low-income housing. All of these things get very technical and are subject to debate. But the point is, what we need are regulations that meet our needs today and don't frustrate us. And we have to address the need for people to have housing in high rent jurisdictions through subsidies. It's inescapable. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. Next, we will hear from Professor Bronin.
Okay, perfect. Hi, everybody. Good morning. Thanks for having me here. This is a great panel, and I'm hopeful that we'll get some great Q&A going, so I'm going to try to keep my remarks somewhat short. I have worn a number of hats, as you heard from Judge Artow's introduction, including deep dives into zoning case law for the restatement, for a zoning treatise I write, for land use, and then for our co-authored book. There's a lot to say about that. But today I actually wanted to focus, given the expertise on this panel and so many different aspects, on a project that I'm working on that was mentioned in the intro as well, called the National Zoning Atlas. So for those of you who have your mobile devices, you can follow along at zoningatlas.org. It is essentially a free resource available to the public that documents zoning conditions across every zoned jurisdiction of the country, which our current count, judging by state zoning enabling acts and who they give authority to, as well as the U.S. Census of Governments, which lists out local governments by type. We think there are 33,337 jurisdictions in the country that have zoning authority. So our job with this project, which includes 28 full-time staff members through an organization that I built, is to read the zoning codes, to copy the maps and digitize them, and to put them together online on a district-by-district basis. So for the first time, people can visually see all of the rules that we're talking about today in an apples-to-apples way, comparing one jurisdiction to the next. So to show you what I mean, I'm just going to show you some images of this map because I really want for you to use it. This is a copy of the screenshot, the first page that you see when you visit the zoning map. So far, we have completed zoning analysis in 14 full states. So those are, maybe you can see in the back, ranging from actually California. We're just a few jurisdictions away from the 539 there, so that'll be coming up maybe this week. But you can see we've done most of New England other than Maine. which has the most crazy restrictive zoning in the entire country, including California. I don't know if anybody here is from Maine. We've done a lot of the Southwest, or all of the Southwest, I guess now, once we include California. And my home state of Texas, I am actually from Houston, which, as some of you may know, is the only large American city without zoning, which makes me super fascinated in the topic. The purple areas on this map at this scale show you which jurisdictions have zoning. The gray areas show you which jurisdictions do not have zoning. Nobody has mapped that information before. And I just want to point out that you see in some states, even similarly situated states like Arizona and New Mexico, where you have a highly regulated approach in Arizona, 104 out of 106 jurisdictions have zoning, and a deregulated approach in New Mexico. Why that is the case when both states allow these jurisdictions to enact zoning, I don't know, but this map raises a lot of questions about the extent of regulation across the country. This is a map from Hermosa Beach, California, just showing you what our analysts do on a day-to-day basis. They look at the maps, they look at the text, there's an image from the table of contents of that jurisdiction on the left, and they put information about those together. So far, we've documented over 8,500 local jurisdictions covering land where more than half of Americans live, and we have read 1 million pages of zoning codes. So this is a crazy project. Almost 100,000 individual zoning districts are on the map. I just wanted to point out one jurisdiction. It was hard to choose, but since this week we just finished our zoning report on Virginia's 321 jurisdictions, meaning we've completed the state, we've written a report about it, and we've delivered some recommendations to the next governor to essentially deregulate and push for deregulation in certain aspects of local zoning. I chose Richmond. So here you see what our map looks like just at a metropolitan area scale. The purple areas on this map show those areas where single-family zoning is allowed. And the number is 72% of the area in the city of Richmond, Virginia, which allows for single-family housing. The next image, again, this is just to illustrate what the map can tell you, shows you where multifamily housing is allowed by right. And I believe that says, let me pull it up on my, the stat says something more like 19%. So 19% of land in Richmond allows for multifamily housing by right. If you look outside in the suburbs, you see a lot less purple. So essentially what we've done with this map is we've enabled people to see how much land within a jurisdiction meets certain regulatory criteria. Missing middle housing, which Professor Somin may talk about, parking mandates, all of that is available online. I encourage you to visit the website, see how your jurisdiction zones. The jurisdictions where you work might be zoned if you're working in zoning matters. And also to use this snapshots feature, which summarizes the statistics across a metro area, a jurisdiction, and even an entire state. So here I've pulled up Richmond, and you can see how those areas on the map stack up in terms of statistics. On the right, you see, well, on the left, you see, actually, so this is the Richmond metro area. And you can see on the top right, and that includes 24 jurisdictions. On the top right, that yellow box that I've highlighted shows you that while Richmond, that's a 4-family category right there, single families on the left. So you see single family has all that blue. That means there's a lot of land allowing for single family, that bar chart with the blue, the light blue, and the gray. On the right is 4 or more family housing. As a metro area, virtually no land allows for multifamily housing by right. From a property rights perspective, these statistics tell a very rule-based, fact-based, geography-based story that's very consistent with what we just heard from the first two panelists, which is exclusionary zoning is unfortunately very common. And whether you come at that angle from a property rights perspective or from a justice perspective, the facts don't lie, and our atlas is there to be used by anybody who's interested in changing zoning. And so this is my last slide. I point you to, we've done a number of publications. Two of our analysts wrote something for a publication called Zoning Practice. In that publication, they analyzed jurisdictions that they'd worked on across 6 states, finding that there was a significant mismatch between the map and the text. So again, zoning codes have 2 parts, the map and the text. The significant mismatch to me raises due process concerns. And again, we've started to expose that at scale. If people cannot understand what the rules are, how should they be expected to abide by them? I hope that people will use the National Zoning Atlas in litigation to challenge cities' practices that aren't really fair to property owners. I would include the due process issues as one of those. I also think that there is room for attorneys to use the Zoning Atlas in zoning interpretations, how zoning laws should be interpreted in individual project applications when you're representing a developer, because if you're going for a variance, you can easily now look at the map without having to sift through a 300-page zoning code yourself and say, do I have an argument here for my property owner about certain aspects of their application. You can use them too in advocating for zoning reform. So the zoning reforms that are needed, some of which Professor Byrne spoke about, can be, I think, supported by our map, and that's what we argued in the report on Virginia we just released. I mentioned due process, and then finally, fair housing and equal protection related litigation. There are good cases to be made across the country that spot zoning infringes on property rights, that differential zoning across jurisdictions has unfortunately differential consequences. I think I encourage you to use the Zoning Atlas and see how some of these conversations that we're talking about today can in fact be justified and illustrated and illuminated by the information that we are documenting in a very painstaking and somewhat painful way in our online map. Thank you.
Okay, and last we will hear from Professor Somin.
Thank you. I'm going to start off by briefly talking about the problem of exclusionary zoning and its enormous effect. Then I'll discuss why most, not all, but most of the exclusionary zoning we see actually violates the takings clause of the Fifth Amendment and often similar state clauses in state constitutions. And then finally, I'll briefly talk about the path forward and how judicial review and litigation can help combine with political reform efforts. Much of what I'm going to cover overlaps with an article I published last year, co-authored with Josh Braver of the University of Wisconsin, called The Constitutional Case Against Exclusionary Zoning. I'm a libertarian originalist. Josh Braver is a progressive living constitutionalist. If we can agree on these issues, I hope perhaps others can as well. So you've already heard from other panelists about the issue of exclusionary zoning and some of its effects. I just want to emphasize a few additional points. One is just the sheer scale of the problem. You saw Professor Bronin's estimates for Virginia and how much exclusionary zoning there is in the state where I live. It's shameful for us, but we are not alone in our shame. The same problem exists in many states around the country. By some estimates, some 75% of all residential land in the United States is zoned for single-family zoning only. And on top of that, we have all sorts of other restrictions, parking minimums, minimum lot sizes, many other things. And in combination, the effect effect is to make housing much more expensive and also to block people, particularly the relatively poor, minorities, the lower middle class, from moving to opportunity. They are closed off from moving to places where they could be more productive, where their children could get a better education. That's bad not only for them, but also for overall economic growth, because if people can't move to where they'll be more productive, where they'll get a better education and so on, they end up being less productive. That's obviously bad for those people who are blocked off, but it's bad for the rest of us too, because we get lower economic growth, we get less innovation, we get more stagnation, and we also get more social pathologies of various types, whether it's drug abuse, crime, and so on, because if people are trapped in places where they have little opportunity, they end up disproportionately turning to those things. This is a serious problem for minorities, blacks, Hispanics, and others, but it's also a serious problem for the white working class, of whose interests we've heard a lot, particularly since the rise of Trump over these last 10 years. And this is actually an area where these two groups have an important common interest. The origins of this problem, as Jim Burling indicated, date back some 100 years to the earliest development of zoning, which originally often was motivated for a long time thereafter by racial exclusion, but also by efforts at economic exclusion as well. While the Supreme Court in 1917 struck down racially exclusionary zoning, then 9 years later in the Euclid case, they upheld economic zoning, which essentially excluded the lower middle class and the poor, and often was used for racial purposes as well, just as Judge Westenhaver, in the opinion that Jim quoted, he predicted that this would be used for racial exclusion, and that is in fact exactly what happened over a period of many years. More recently, in current Supreme Court precedent, most zoning restrictions and other restrictions in housing construction fall under the so-called Penn Central three-factor balancing test. I'll spare you the painful details of this test, but the bottom line under it is that the government almost always wins, and therefore there's very few current and current precedent constitutional constraints on exclusionary zoning. In my view, this is wrong. If you think about it from an original meaning point of view, we would want to ask yourself, what does the takings clause of the Fifth Amendment mean? It says that the government must pay just compensation if they take private property. What counts as private property? Well, if you look at 1791, when the Fifth Amendment and the rest of the Bill of Rights were first enacted, it is very clear that private property rights included the right to use property. William Blackstone famously said so in his commentaries on the laws of England. He said, property includes the free use, enjoyment, and disposal of all acquisitions. James Madison said much the same thing in his speech introducing the Bill of Rights to Congress. He was the primary drafter, in particular, of the Takings Clause. It's in the Constitution because of him, and this is a standard formulation of property rights that was often used in the founding era. There was general agreement that it included the right to use, and it seems very obvious that building housing, including non-single family housing and other types of housing, is a standard element of the right to use. Now, some originalists say when you look at the Bill of Rights and how it applies to state and local governments, what you should look at is not the understanding in 1791, but rather that in 1868, when the Bill of Rights first became applicable to state and local governments as a result of the 14th Amendment. And of course, it is in fact state and local governments that do almost all exclusionary zoning. If you look at 1868, as Braver and I do in detail in our article, there's a lot of evidence that the right to use also was considered an element of property rights at that time as well. Leading Supreme Court and state Supreme Court precedents of that era said so. Leading legal treatises like that by Thomas Cooley also said as much, and there's a lot of other evidence that we canvass in our article. Now, I don't claim that the right to use is absolute. in both of these periods, it is clear that there was the so-called police power exception, situations where your use of the property threatens public health and safety, but this is a relatively narrow exception that certainly doesn't encompass the vast majority of exclusionary zoning. There's no health and safety threat merely from having multifamily housing or from not having parking minimums or having a smaller or bigger lot and the like. I do think the example that Peter Byrne gave of the diseased rats, that might well fall within the police power exception, and therefore if you have a regulation says we need to take precautions at your restaurant or other facility to prevent rats from infesting the area, that's fine, but most exclusionary zoning can't possibly be justified on that basis. Now, there may not be very many living constitutionalists present at this particular event, but in our article we also explain how living constitution theory of various kinds also supports much the same conclusion. For example, a leading area of living constitution theory is so-called representation reinforcement theory, which is the idea that judicial review should provide special protection to groups that can't fend for themselves in the political process, and particularly to historically discriminate against racial and ethnic and other minorities. And exclusionary zoning very clearly, historically and also today, disproportionately targets and harms the poor, racial and ethnic minorities. There's a long and awful history of racism. And also in some ways, it is even worse than other kinds of targeting of racial and ethnic and other unpopular weak minorities, because the biggest victims of exclusionary zoning are those people who are never able to move into a community in the first place and therefore are never able to vote or otherwise influence the regulations and laws that prevent them from moving in. So in that respect, it's even worse than John Hart Ely's famous example of minorities who may have the vote, but they're excluded because they just constantly get outvoted. The biggest victims of exclusionary zoning are people who don't even have a vote in the relevant jurisdiction at all. In our article, we also talk about other living constitution theories, but I know time is limited, so I'll cover those in questions if people are interested. What are some options for the future of what we can do? The simplest approach would be for the court to adopt a rule under which exclusionary zoning, except that covered by the police power exception, is what is known as a per se taking, that is automatically considered a taking, and the government owes compensation. If the government had to pay compensation to all the many property owners who are currently covered by exclusionary zoning, they would have to give up the exclusionary zoning, or at least a vast bulk of it. They might be willing to pay compensation to a few people in a few places, but not to 75% of all residential property owners in the United States. There's another alternative of you don't completely take it out of the Penn Central test, but instead you make that test less deferential. In our article, we outline ways that this can be done. And the good news also, you don't even necessarily have to overrule the Euclid decision in order to make this happen. I personally would be fine with getting rid of Euclid. I wouldn't miss it in any way, shape, or form. But if you're more squeamish than I am about overruling precedent, then you can simply note that Euclid itself never actually mentions the takings clause of the Fifth Amendment at all. Rather, it just says that this is the rule under the due process clause of the 14th Amendment. The reason for this is that Euclid was decided at a time when the Supreme Court had not yet held explicitly that the takings clause is incorporated against the states. So if you wanted to go to federal court to litigate takings issues against state or local governments, you had to use the due process clause. There's a long and complicated story behind this that I tell in one of my books. But the bottom line is that if you want stronger judicial review of zoning under the takings clause, all you got to do is say that Euclid does not apply to the takings clause. The Supreme Court has already come close to saying this in a 2005 case, and you wouldn't have to overrule it. It is not my view that judicial review by itself can solve all of our problems. Rather, what I seek is synergies between that and political reform efforts, and there are parallels to that in previous efforts to expand property rights in the public use area, which I talk about in my book, The Grasping Hand, and also to other constitutional reform movements like the movement for racial equality, the same-sex marriage movement, and many others. And I think there are ways that these things can be mutually reinforcing. Finally, I'll say a brief word about rent control, which perhaps some would say is an alternative way to address the same problem. I will merely say it's not going to work. It's basic Econ 101 that it won't work, that when you impose price controls, you actually reduce the supply of whatever product or good it is that you've imposed the price controls on. This is an area of broad cross-ideological agreement among economists. Don't take my word for it. Take Paul Krugman's, who has written about this, or other left-of-center economists and housing experts. Now maybe Mayor Mamdani will finally succeed, what in my native country of Russia used to be called, in building the new socialist man, or now also the new socialist woman, who does not need economic incentives to produce useful things or produce housing. But I suspect he will not, in fact, succeed where Lenin and Stalin and Mao and others failed, and therefore rent control probably will not solve New York City's problems. On the other hand, zoning deregulation, which some of the other winners in recent elections, including our governor-elect in Virginia, Governor Spanberger, they promised that they will do at least some of these things. I think that is a better path forward, unless, of course, we do finally get the new socialist man. But unless and until that happens, what we want to do is enforce the takings clause of the Fifth Amendment better, similar provisions in state constitutions, and combine litigation with political reform efforts. Thank you.
I'm going to ask the panelists for responses. I'm going to stay on track in terms of time. I'll ask everybody to limit themselves to about 2 minutes each. And we will start with response from Mr. Burling.
So first of all, I have to admit that when Peter and I are in agreement, I have to seriously rethink, am I thinking correctly? Is there something wrong with what I'm thinking? So yeah, I mean, I think we pretty much everybody agrees that the large lot exclusionary zoning problems that we have are the number one thing we can do to get rid of some of the housing crisis. Allow people to build the homes where people want to live in the way and the manner of the homes they want to build. Now, where I do disagree, and I have some great skepticism about that subsidies are the answer. If you subsidize the consumers of housing without increasing the supply, you are going to raise the prices. If you talk about subsidizing the builders of housing, then I hope it would work, but it hasn't worked very well yet. In my book, Nowhere to Live, I have examples of million-dollar apartments, subsidized apartments in California, because if you have subsidized apartments in California, you have to have a project labor agreement, and you have to throw economics out the window. You have to have all the bells and whistles of a house. And I have a picture in my book of a subsidized housing apartment that is right on the beach south of San Francisco. Beautiful area. And yeah, these are million-dollar apartments, but they're subsidized for lower-income people. I would suggest the alternative is to have the market just go crazy and build everything it can anywhere. Don't worry if it's subsidized or not, because you have the move-up effect. People who move into a new house generally move out of an older one. And the older house, people that move into that one move out of an even older or smaller house. I mean, I moved from my 900 square foot home to a larger one, et cetera. Now I'm getting older, we move into a smaller one. But that's just the way it's supposed to work, and you don't need subsidies to make that happen. You need to unleash home building in America. You need to take away all the choke points that Peter talked about. You need to free up land that is tied up in endangered species and Clean Water Act and environmental overlays in the coastal zone, all those things that I know you love, but you need to free that up. That's my response. I think Sarah's map is great, and I think we're all going to use that. And Ilya and I sometimes we have to out-libertarian one another, but you know, I want to get rid of Euclid, and that is one of my life's goals. So there.
Professor Byrne.
So it's interesting that the some of you would in law school have read about the Mount Laurel cases in New Jersey, which were the first really concerted litigation efforts to address exclusionary zoning. And they were brought by the NAACP, was the main plaintiff in the case. And the concern was the racial aspects of exclusionary zoning, but there were a whole host of different legal theories that went into it. The point just is that but not the takings clause. I mean, I think that in general, litigation is a good way to raise issues, but it's not a good way to settle them. And so, I'm very dubious of Ilya's arguments about the takings clause being an effective tool to address exclusionary zoning. A lot of the plaintiffs, of course, are people who can't move into a community because of exclusionary zoning. They don't have property rights, okay? The owners do, but exclusionary zoning basically arose because local governments wanted to attract higher income residents in order to prop up their property tax revenues. And there were exclusionary aspects in terms of race and religion and all sorts of things that are offensive, but offensive grounds. But it was essentially a tool for its time. Today, the problem really is that supply and demand are out of whack, but demand has gone bonkers in terms of the communities where there are high-paying jobs. And, Detroit and Cleveland don't have an exclusionary zoning problem. They're still demolishing housing to try to establish a ground for a real estate market. So the level of demand is so high that means the price of land is very high, that for a developer there, without subsidies of some sort, there's no incentive to build for low-income people. You're going to build luxury housing, right? Now, Jim mentioned the filtering effects that come when people move into luxury housing and abandon housing that's farther down the economic ladder. But filtering is a very slow process. It takes a very long time, and it's not site-specific. So that the lower income housing that people may be moving out of is not going to be in the middle of San Francisco or New York or Boston. It's going to be somewhere on the periphery in some place that is less desirable. Now, when you build in those, when you start to move into those areas that are less desirable, and you build to higher densities, you're going to immediately raise the value of the real estate. So you're going to, to the extent it's part of the same market, you're going to generate a lot of the same economic problems on the periphery that you already have in the center. So it's that kind of economic dynamic that leads me to conclude that some form of subsidy is necessary in high demand jurisdictions in order for, certainly firemen and school teachers to live, but also just poor people, the people who wash dishes in a restaurant. The market is not going to provide them to do it. To the extent it does it, they have to, people in Washington, they live in West Virginia, and they drive 2 hours. That's not good. That's not good. So I'll just stop there for now.
Okay. Response from Professor Bronin.
Thanks. Yeah, these have been such interesting presentations. I think I agree with a lot of what Professor Somin said about the case against exclusionary zoning generally. I think we've seen, especially in our work, just a steady slog going through these zoning codes, revealing that there's a lot of restrictions across the country on housing. I think I would point to the city on the subsidy versus deregulation question. I would point to the city of Austin, the city of Denver, and particularly Austin in my native state. It legalized lots of housing, and if you've been to that city recently, you see tall building after tall building of homes, condos, lots of development within city limits. And you have seen developers complain about prices falling. And what happened there was deregulation, essentially, I guess if that's our word of the day, leading to the construction of lots of housing, which then, again, developers are complaining there's too much housing. Why did we allow this housing to be built? And people in Austin are benefiting in maybe a faster way than in most communities, because it's a very desirable place to live from the filtering effect. I do think, though, that the jury is still out when we make big claims about what zoning causes, in what types of markets, and how. We actually don't have a lot of data and information that can support some of the claims that many different, sides in the housing-related debate are moving forward. So while there have been studies on zoning and changes in zoning in very limited contexts, we don't have information about changes at scale, and we don't have information that's truly causal in a lot of cases. That's where I hope our project will come in to help develop, again, in lots of different jurisdictions. We've logged zoning in areas, and now we're going back and we're logging changes. So, for example, in Massachusetts, the change that's mandating local governments to rezone around transit stations. We have the before, we're about to have the after, once the last jurisdictions get their changes in and approved by the Attorney General. Similarly, in California, we have almost 539 jurisdictions in the book. We're about to go back through the state. We've been funded to do that, to go back through, and we'll be logging changes, including from the recent bill SB 79, which is also transit-oriented rezoning. Those kinds of before and after analyses at a much bigger scale will, I think, help to inform this conversation. And again, provide fodder for the kinds of changes, whether it's through advocacy or litigation, that can move the zoning in a more positive direction than where we have seen it land today. So stay tuned.
Thank you. And last, we'll hear a response from Professor Somin.
Yeah. So there is more agreement on this panel than I had envisioned, or I thought there might be when I originally envisioned the idea for the panel. But I will note a couple of disagreements, primarily with Peter Byrne. One is on the issue of the effectiveness of, and yeah, we do agree on some things too, like the diseased rats, and also we agree on, that there is a serious problem with exclusionary zoning, and that's important because, we are people who have been arguing about other issues in property rights and takings for many years now. But I will briefly note sort of these disagreements. One is about the potential effectiveness of litigation. He's right that the Mount Laurel litigation in New Jersey by no means fully succeeded in achieving the goals that the NAACP and others hope to accomplish in terms of affordable housing in that state, but they have made some progress, and it's better than if the Mount Laurel litigation had not occurred. I think also part of the reason why they didn't achieve more is because, in fact, they weren't doing this under a property rights theory. They did not have a theory under which the result is if you win is that people can just build the housing that they want under property. They ended up litigating under a provision of state constitution where when they won, it essentially assigns quotas of housing to different local governments, and there are many problems and inefficiencies with that. Whereas a simple takings theory, if you win, the result is they have to let you build housing that you want, with rare exceptions like the diseased rats, and if they don't let you, they have to pay you compensation, and that provides a much stronger incentive to allow actual housing to go forward, a minimum of red tape, obstacles, and the like. I don't claim it will solve all our problems, but it would be an enormous step forward if we could do this. Peter raised the issue of who will bring the cases. It's true under current rules, which I would like to change, but under current rules, probably people excluded from the community would not have standing to bring the cases, but property owners would. And while some property owners are obviously so-called NIMBYs, not in my backyard people who want to maintain exclusionary zoning, others may want to sell the property to developers who would build more housing, and either they or the developers could bring those cases and would have strong incentives to do so. The other issue I'd like to briefly comment on is the whole debate about subsidies versus deregulation. I think examples like Austin and others that Sara mentioned show that you can, in fact, have enormous progress, including for the poor and lower middle class, with little or nothing in the way of subsidies. We also have examples abroad. In Japan, where in the city of Tokyo, the most desirable area in that country, they have very few restrictions on building housing, and as a result, millions of poor people over time, poorer people have been able to live in Tokyo where they can be more productive than other parts of Japan. You have a similar story more recently with deregulation in New Zealand, where they have achieved a great increase in housing, including for the poor and lower middle class, in places where previously there were severe problems, and also the city of Houston, the one big city with no zoning. That doesn't mean they have no restrictions at all. They still have other restrictions, which I think sometimes are too great. Nonetheless, in Houston, it is the case that lower middle class and poor people can live reasonably affordably, even close to the city center, and find jobs. I was very impressed when I lived there myself on a relatively small law clerk salary of the kind that many of you law students may have in the year after you graduate, and I could get a pretty nice one-bedroom apartment very close to the city center. Why? Because Houston doesn't have zoning. And it is a very in-demand area. It is not like Detroit or Cleveland or whatnot. And so I think it is a telling case. So I don't think I can completely solve all problems just by deregulating zoning, but it would be enormous progress, and it's better than attempts at subsidies or rent control or other schemes of that sort. Thank you.
All right, well, I have one quick question because I want to allow some time for and we're running out of time, so I want to allow a little bit of time for audience questions. But Professor Somin mentioned not in my backyard. What about yes in my backyard? Professor Burling? Mr. Burling?
Yeah,
Sorry.
I am not a professor. I am a member of society.
Yes.
So the yes in my
Corrected.
backyard movement is an amazing phenomenon. People started showing up at hearings in California where the usual NIMBYs were there to stop a building project. And these people showing up in the audience saying, I want you to build this thing. I want you to build this thing. And people, who are these people? Well, they are the yes in my backyard people. They are a combination of libertarian types and socialist types that agree we need more housing. We disagree on whether or not there need more subsidies, but they have done some very good work. Say the California YIMBY, Nolan Gray and his company, his group have done some help getting reform through the California legislature, incremental reform, but allowing higher density housing near transit and other things of that nature. So I think YIMBY shows that there is such I talked initially about the studies from '69 and 1991. Now that the problem has gotten worse and worse and worse, there is a natural reaction, and the YIMBYs are opposed to the NIMBYs, and I think that's great. It's going to play out in the political process, and I think I am hopeful.
Professor Byrne?
Oh, I agree, but I would just say that there's a huge range, right? We talk about YIMBYs and NIMBYs, but most people are in between in some way, and the issues tend to be site-specific. In general, isn't it a good thing that there's a widespread political movement saying we need to have more housing, we need to have more supply to try to deal with the affordability crisis? That's a good thing.
Okay. Professor Bronin?
Is the question, what do we think about YIMBYs? Or what, I guess if that's the question, I support the movement. We work with we work with any group who asks for information through the National Zoning Atlas. But I think the Yes in My Backyard movement has has become a real model for organizing around a very simple idea, which is more housing. So I think it's been a really productive thing. I think it's been a way to take these conversations that we can have amongst lawyers and citing case law down to just the level of this is what we need, and we're going to get it through organizing and political advocacy. And I think they've been very effective both nationally and at the local level. And that's actually exactly what the scholars and the data gatherers and the jurists, who are interested and involved in these issues from a legal technical standpoint, have needed, and I think it's been great.
So I'm a big supporter of the YIMBY movement, both where I live in Arlington and more generally. It's great, but I do have two reservations about its effectiveness. One is if you look at social science research on who actually shows up to zoning board meetings and lobbies about these issues, the political scientist Catherine Einstein and her co-authors, they have a great book called Neighborhood Defenders, and sadly, overwhelmingly, the people who show up are in fact the NIMBYs, not the YIMBYs. They're very unrepresentative of their communities. They tend to be older, wealthier, more white, and so forth. And so that's a real obstacle to the success of YIMBYism. A second issue is that we don't just face opposition from NIMBYs, who are classically people of a kind of self-interest, in keeping out poor people, or in some cases racially different people and the like. We also face opposition from just a simple problem of economic ignorance, that large parts of the population, when you do surveys, they don't realize that building more housing will reduce prices. They actually believe the opposite, many of them. They think if you build more housing, that will raise the prices because rich people will hoard all the housing or some other dynamic will occur. I've written more generally about political ignorance in my book, Democracy and Political Ignorance. Yes, shameless self-promotion is a risk with academics when you deal with them, and this is an example of it. So I totally think the YIMBY movement is a valuable movement. It has made some important progress in various places like Minneapolis and Austin and elsewhere, but I do think it needs the assistance of litigation of the kind I mentioned earlier, and in some cases, statewide reform may be easier to achieve than reform at a local level where the NIMBYs are particularly powerful. I have also urged YIMBY advocates to consider statewide referendums in places like California, where you can amend the state constitution by that path.
Okay, thank you. I think we have, we're almost out of time, but we're going to take one or two questions from the floor. Do we have a question? Yes.
I'm Roger Pilon, Cato Institute. My question is for Peter Byrne. Ilya put to you, or I'm going to put to you, the point that Ilya made. Namely, you have approached the housing crisis as though zoning were constitutional. One can raise that point and then put to you the problem that you have given short shrift to the market solution to the housing crisis. And so I wonder if you would address the Houston issue as a prime example of how we can address the housing crisis without zoning.
Houston, I don't think you can, zoning basically is a technique of public regulation of land use development, right? So what you have in Houston is a devolution of that to private developers. So you have an enormous web
That's
of
the
private
point.
restrictions that are enforceable in court.
And can I just add here as a Houstonian, in my book, I talk about this story of my uncle who owns a business who was prevented from building his small business by putting it in an area on a commercial street where there were residential restrictive covenants. So to Peter's point, this system of private regulation in Houston has absolutely destroyed, I think, in too many places, the ability of the city to change. The reliance on private covenants has backfired on the property rights movement. And I think my uncle's story, trying to build his veterinary clinic on West Alabama, which is a commercial street, and being prevented from doing so by the city, is a prime example of how Houston's lack people will always want to order their communities. Zoning is a good way to do that. Restrictive covenants and private rules are not. In this case, at least.
So he wanted the government to overrule private arrangements. That's the
so
problem.
in this case, absolutely, it was preventing him from doing something in Houston that would have actually contributed to commerce.
I'm shocked.
Well, I know that there are other questions, so the panel will stay around afterwards up front here if whatever panel members are available to ask individual questions, but we are unfortunately out of time because the next event is the Rosencrantz Luncheon and Debate held in the International Ballroom Center starting directly after this panel. So we are now adjourned. Thank you.